Thank you for joining our Planning for Budget Deficits webinar. TVC is the region's leading arts and service organization. It's our mission to foster a more resilient creative ecosystem for Washington County. That's why we created this COVID-19 emergency response series, where we're offering short, free informational webinars to help our community navigate resources and challenges related to the pandemic. You can find more of our workshops and networking events on our website. And without further ado, we have speaker Jeff Pazdalski, who is the Executive Director of the Westside Transportation Alliance and serves on the Board of Directors of the Transportation Options Group of Oregon. And I'll hand it over to Jeff to talk about strategies for budget shortfalls.
Great. Well, thanks, Ashley. Let me, let's see, share my screen here. There we go. Well, again, thanks, Ashley. And so I just thought maybe give a little bit more of kind of an introduction of myself, since I'm not able to actually meet people in person these days. So my background, I've been with different nonprofit organizations for the past almost 25 years now, starting in a program role where I was overseeing programs over a one county area and then a couple of counties and then on a statewide basis. And I was in that role in 2001 when the 9/11 attacks happened, and then kind of dealing with the budget deficit resulting from that, kind of the economic situation post that event. So had that experience on a program side, after which I kind of moved into a development role and spent a considerable amount of time as a development director with a performing arts organization here in Portland. And I was in that role when the Great Recession happened in kind of 07 and 08, and sort of had to deal with budget deficits at that point from that chair. And then since then, I've been in executive director roles with a couple of organizations. And so, currently with my organization, we're going through our own process of figuring out how we're going to deal with the projected budget deficits resulting from COVID. So I guess I say all of that, if nothing else, to prove that I'm old, but also, hopefully I've been able to pick up a couple of things through these experiences through the years that will be useful. So just as a kind of an intro point here, this is a quote. It has nothing to do with budgeting or nonprofit management. The person who said this is actually a professional bike racer, so I'm a bit of a bike racing nerd. And he was talking about it in the context of athletic events and bike racing, and never feeling like you're ready enough when the race starts. But it's something that when I read this, it really resonated with me, because I feel like it really applies to a lot of situations, and especially to the current, because you as a leader may not feel ready, you may not feel like your organization's ready, but kind of because of COVID-19, it's time. So we kind of have to deal with things. So my hope today, I'm going to run through just a couple of thoughts and ideas, and my goal is just to offer really some food for thought, maybe some conversation starters for you and your organizations, because I know that every situation is unique, and every organization, although we're all experiencing this together, everybody's sort of reality is different because of their organization and their resources. And so, everybody will need to follow their own path. And I really do believe that although there's not one true, path through this that leads to success, that there's a lot of paths through this that are going to lead to positive outcomes for organizations. So, everybody will need to find their own way, and hopefully, we'll get some ideas through this that can help. So I've sort of loosely organized my ideas here kind of into four main groups. So the first, obviously, talking about planning. So I think there's a tendency for some organizations to want to rush into action. They know that a budget deficit's coming, or they're experiencing it in the now, and so they want to be like the hare here and rush into action and just start doing something to address it. And so I guess my advice is to sort of embrace your inner tortoise and slow down a little bit initially, and take the time to really plan and be thoughtful, and to think about how you want to proceed and some of your goals and objectives. You may not move as quickly initially, but it's going to serve you better in the long term, because if organizations that kind of rush into action, you know, they may end up discovering that they're spending time on supporting things and spending time on programs and outcomes that really aren't where they decide they want to be centered. So just be confident and assure your team that there's time to plan and to slow down and to think about that. And as I say that, you know, just keeping in mind that the goal of this plan is not, I think sometimes people hear planning and they think, oh, you know, it's just got to be this fancy process. I mean, you know, that's leading toward like this big document or something. And the goal of the planning, this type of planning anyways, in my mind, is not to, you know, create some fancy thing that's posted on the website or you know, sits on the shelf or whatever. The objective here is the process. So is to have those conversations and to do that critical thinking. And so whatever process it is that feels true for your organization, that's the right process for you, that there is no one process. The value really comes from thinking critically about your programs and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and engaging other people in those conversations. Even if it's just one or two other people, just getting them involved and you know, hearing their ideas can often spark some new thoughts, and giving them a chance to think about your goals and outcomes in a new way. And what I think you'll find is these conversations and this planning, they're going to help guide your decisions that are coming, because one of the unfortunate sort of realities in times of a budget deficit is you as a leader are going to need to make some hard choices. You're probably going to have to say no to some things that you might want to say yes to, or that you would say yes to in other times. But having these conversations and doing this planning, it helps support you in making those decisions, because it not only gives you something to refer to and to help guide your decisions, but it also helps support those decisions so that the rest of the leadership and support base of your organization, they can understand why the choices are being made. And I put the last point on there largely for myself, because this is something that my team and I always ask them to kind of check me on this, because I tend to overplan. I can have that tendency to get, you know, I really want to just finish it and make it perfect. And so you have to kind of know when to say when with stuff. And sometimes you can get 90% of the way there pretty quickly. And it's that last 10%, you know, you could just spend a lot of time grinding on it. But for these purposes, sort of knowing when you have enough, have had enough of those discussions, and you've had to have enough things, you know, clarified in terms of what are the goals that we're trying to achieve, knowing that when you've done enough of that and you're comfortable with that, to go ahead and move on. It doesn't have to be perfect. It needs to just give you this foundation for kind of the future decisions that you need to make. And then with all of this planning and those conversations, really, as your foundation, that helps you, I think, kind of think about your programming. And it was hard to think of how to talk about programming, because I know there's so many different types of organizations that are involved with TVC. So just keeping it real general, you know, using that planning to help think about your programs. And I would say the main advice is to think about how can you simplify what you're doing. Or, you know, a different way to say it might be to focus on doing less things better. So not spreading your organization quite as thin. And again, that is going to depend on what your work is. But your planning process will hopefully help guide these choices, and it may identify, these are really the outcomes that are core to what we do, and these other things we definitely support and want to do, but maybe those are for now secondary, and that can help you hopefully make some smart choices about which programs to lean into. And a benefit of that, I think, is it helps, because I think there's a temptation, and I've been with organizations that have responded to budget deficits this way, where there's the temptation of, okay, we just need to cut budgets, so everything needs to cut 10%, and it's kind of that level haircut. And I believe that that's not the right way to approach it. That having those conversations about the planning and thinking about simplifying programs, you may realize that there's one or two of your programs that, wow, those are really core to the goals that we want to focus on in this time. And maybe there's, if you do need to cut some things, maybe you make the decision that there's no cuts on those programs because those are really core to what we need to do. And there's some other programs where maybe we can cut a little more deeply for now because we've realized that those aren't the essential things to where we want to be going right now. But I should apologize that I keep using the word cut, because I would actually caution against thinking about cutting, and maybe, and that's kind of the second bullet here, is it's thinking about maybe the expectations of outputs. So maybe there's opportunities, instead of just saying we're cutting this, to say, here's some things that we know we had planned this year. Can we push that to next year? Can we, is there a new program we were going to launch that maybe we decide to postpone for now, or there were some aspects of this program that we're going to downsize for now, with an expectation that we're going to add that back in later when X, Y, and Z conditions are met, whether that's financially or through some other programmatic outputs. So rather than thinking initially of just cutting, are there ways that you can thoughtfully rethink your programs so that you're still demonstrating to your supporters in the community, we're still committed to this, but we're just going to be approaching it in a different way because of the economic reality. And then the last point here is, I debated between putting opportunity for invention or necessity is the mother, or opportunity for innovation or necessity is the mother of invention there, because, I thought of them both with this bullet point, and just wanted to kind of throw out there that I think in times of a budget deficit, when you're thinking about how do we restructure and how do we do with less resources potentially, it can almost foster a closed-mindedness where you stop thinking about innovation and doing new things, and everything we have to tract, we have to circle the wagons kind of thing. And don't lose sight of that this can be an opportunity for innovation. And there can be some new ideas and new processes that come out of this that are going to benefit your organization once we get to the other side of the deficit. And so it can be hard to be open-minded to that, but there are opportunities for good things programmatically to come out of this as you kind of reassess what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it. Kind of the next big piece in my mind is really, once you've had those conversations on the planning side and really thoughtfully reviewed your programs and how you're going to do things, is how are you communicating that? Because you need to let people know why you're doing it and the process that you've gone through. And so when I say communications in this context, I'm not thinking of sort of marketing in the sense of selling tickets or getting people to come to a gallery or a show or something like that. This is really about communicating with your other leadership, your core support base, and to a certain extent the community about this process. And here's how we're responding to the budget deficit. Here's why we're doing the things we're doing and making the choices that we're making. So in general, want to make sure that you're communicating more with people and not less. And I think there's sometimes a tendency of, well, people don't want to hear the bad news from us that we're restructuring things, but let people know what you're doing, and most importantly, let them know why you're doing it. And this refers back to that planning process, where if you've had those thoughtful conversations with your core kind of support group and leadership group, it gives you that basis to really back up these choices and say, we had these conversations and identified that our key goals are X and Y, and so because of that, we're doing this with our programs, or not doing this. But it gives you that again, foundation. And in the same way that I sort of recommended simplifying your programs, just as you're doing these communications, try to simplify your language as much as possible. And this is something that I always have to ask my coworkers to help me with, because I tend to drop into acronyms and things. And I always, this is another reference that's going to date myself, but I think back to the movie Philadelphia from many, many years ago. Denzel Washington's character in that movie was a lawyer, and he often had this little phrase where he would ask people to explain it to me like I'm an 8-year-old, or explain it to me like I'm a 9-year-old. And it was just his little trick for getting people to really slow down and explain things as simply as possible. And so, as you're communicating more with your base, think about that simple language, because it's going to help people more clearly understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. It's also going to show that you really, sort of embrace that too. And it's going to help transfer across different platforms. So if you need to communicate with some people via a newsletter or e-newsletter or Twitter or Facebook or, postcards, whatever, having that simple language will make sure your message stays consistent across the different platforms. And then the little graphic on the right here is I think trying to visualize the goal of all of this with these communications, because you have people that know of your organization. Maybe they know what you do, some of the work you do. What you're really trying to make sure that happens with these communications in this language and this whole process is to make sure they understand why you're doing what you're doing and making the choices that you're making, and supporting the programs and asking for the support that you're asking for. Because once somebody then understands, they're much more likely to engage, because they're going to have that, hopefully that shared support of the same outcomes that your organization is trying to achieve. And then once they engage, they're going to know your organization and your work on a whole deeper level, which leads to more understanding and more engagement. And so I draw this as kind of an inward spiral toward the heart or the core of your organization. And that's really what you're trying to do through these communications and this whole process is get people to know and understand, so that you bring them in closer to the core of what you're doing. And then the last category, and this is really the end point, I think, through this is with the planning as your foundation, and the thoughtful work on your programs, and then thinking about how and when, and communicating this, the decisions. You do all of that really to find your allies, because they're going to be the ones to help you and your organization get through these budget deficits in some ways. And so what I started here at the top, I put an affinity scale. So if you think about that, the folks on the 10 end, those are your hardcore supporters. They get you. That's your group, your go-to group you can go to. and pretty much, whether it's you pick up the phone and call them or shoot them an email and they've got your back. The other end of the scale are the folks that, they haven't had that aha moment. They haven't clicked with your organization yet. And the folks in the middle, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. So sometimes I think there's a tendency to say, well, we've already got the 8s, 9s, and 10s. We've got them. We need to really invest in the 1s, 2s, and 3s and flip them. Get them to the other end of the scale. Because if we can do that, it'll bring all these resources. And I would initially maybe caution against that, because that can be a long process, and sometimes there's reasons why those folks are not as engaged as they potentially could be. And so that tends to be, I think, in my experience, a little bit more of a longer term process. And sometimes you need things to go a little bit faster when you're facing the budget, a budget deficit. So my suggestion would be really lean into your 9s and your 10s. You've already got those folks closer to you. So start with them and then work out from that group. And consider the hidden opportunities. And what I mean from that is there's a couple of ways to address budget deficits. I think the most maybe obvious way is you can make more money. So we get more donations, we sell more tickets, that sort of thing. But that's not always the easiest solution, or not always an option for every organization in these times. So there's also, you can address a budget deficit by trying to offset some of your expenses, or looking for maybe more kind of entrepreneurial partnerships that result in revenue coming into your organization. So I think, maybe the simplest answer for kind of that offsetting expenses idea is, something as simple as printing costs. And I've had this work for me successfully at a couple of organizations I've been with, where we've had line items for printing costs for different projects. And it turns out that a partner, maybe it's an employer, one of your board members or something, it'll be different for each organization, but a partner may have a capacity to do printing on a whole different scale, and something that seems like a really big job to your organization might seem like nothing, or a very small job to this other organization. And so there may be opportunities within your network, within kind of your 8s, 9s, and 10s, to get some of those expenses in your budget taken care of as a kind of an in-kind donation, and just to it works out. It's still a net positive in your budget. So printing is typically an easier one to think about. Sometimes there's some other services, looking at your budget, are there things that you might be able to tap into that group and ask for some help to relieve those costs in that budget. And then I mentioned kind of some entrepreneurial opportunities too. And so I'll say that, I know that is something that different arts organizations are going to have a different appetite for and maybe interest in, and some are not interested in that, and some are a little more open to it. So you have to kind of find your comfort level with it, and see where you might where there might be opportunities that are still kind of within, like your comfort zone for your organization. But those could include things, and this is a category of things that are going to bring value to a potential partner. So it could be logo placement on programs or different things. It could be opportunities for a partner to communicate with your audience in some way, and that could be coupons or promotions or just opportunities for them to communicate with your audience. And again, those are things you're going to have to find your own comfort level with where you are with that. But those are things that if you approach a potential partner with, you're not asking them to give you a donation. You're providing a service to them that has a value, and they're compensating you for that service. And so it's a way to think about having some revenue come in, but in a little different way. So I guess don't undersell the value of some of these things that you can offer to some of your partners. And those opportunities can also be less transactional. I mentioned ads and coupons and things like that, and those are pretty transactional, but they can also be opportunities because of your shared goals and shared outcomes. So an example I'll give is an organization that the performing arts organization that I was with, there was a particular project that we were working on that we identified one of the goals was to tap into some different curriculum areas. It was involving some youth programming, and this project tapped into some curriculum areas that were a little bit outside of where the organization usually ended up in. And so because of that, we started looking around and we're like, well, who are some other businesses that are also interested in educational opportunities in these other curriculum areas? And we identified a partnership opportunity that worked out great. We got a sponsorship, and this other organization was delighted that they were able to provide opportunities for their employees and their employees' families, and they were able to kind of demonstrate their own belief in these community goals through the partnership. So they got a lot of value out of it, and our organization got a lot of value out of it, and it was really based around those shared goals and outcomes that we were working towards. So, and again, that goes back to your planning process and really being clear about what are the things we're trying to lean into in this time. And then once you have those, kind of stepping back and looking around a little bit and thinking, are there other people that we know that are marketing themselves with those same goals in mind, or that they have those same outcomes? So, so that's another way to think about that. The last point on here is something that probably seems obvious: ask for help. But what I mean by that is sometimes it's easier to ask for help instead of money. So I once had a mentor of mine say the best way to get somebody to give you a donation is to ask them for help. And so this is also a good strategy, I think, because there's some, if you yourself or your organization, your support, if there's a nervousness around asking somebody for a donation or asking somebody to help support you financially, this can be another strategy for that, is you can ask them to help you. And what I mean by that is kind of an example of, if you have somebody who's kind of one of those 9s and 10s, and you think they might be able to provide one of these services to kind of offset a cost in your budget, but you're a little nervous about asking them, is you could approach them and say, we've had these conversations, we've identified this as an opportunity for us potentially to find some in-kind support. We know that you work in this field, so can you help us? How do we ask people? How do we ask companies for the support? Who should we talk to? What are the right messages? And get them, ask them at that strategic level to help guide your approach. And usually what'll happen is they'll end up either jumping in and giving you some really good advice that'll help guide that, or sometimes they even, as they get involved, they'll come to you and say, hey, I could just do this, or my company can do this. And that's, it's kind of the best possible outcome. It doesn't always happen that way, but it's a strategy that can help. Again, if there's that nervousness around asking somebody for a donation, is just ask for their kind of strategic help instead. And then final thoughts, I guess just know that your organization can and will ultimately come out of this stronger. It's going to, having these conversations, these planning conversations, and these really thoughtful decisions and thinking about your programs, it's going to bring your leadership team closer. It's going to create a sense within your leadership and within your organization of inner strength. We can do this kind of thing. And it's going to really make sure that your organization and again, your core support base and your leadership team is really connected to your goals and your outcomes and what you're trying to do. And those are all things that once you get through the budget deficit in this time, it's really going to help your organization ultimately to come out. And I guess I would just, say that be confident that you and your organization have the resources and abilities to weather this storm. Each organization is going to have to find their own path through it, but know that you have what you need there. And sometimes it's just a matter of asking for that help and tapping into it. So I guess Ashley and the rest of the TVC team, thanks for this opportunity. And I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. I do have one question. You were talking about, prioritizing programs and leaning into your audience members who have a lot of affinity for your organization. I'm just wondering, what is the best way you've found to get that feedback? Because sometimes it's really hard to tell which program to prioritize if you're not sure what people want more of. So we've tried surveys and it's just really hard to get people to complete surveys. So I'm wondering if you have any other suggestions on how to figure out who's the most engaged and which programs they most want to see.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the cop-out answer is it's different for every organization. But I would suggest, again, kind of going back to my experiences, we would sometimes start with, if you have, say, example, a performing arts organization and you have season tickets, you can look at people that have been consistent supporters over a number of years, or if there's donors, kind of looking at your higher level donors and maybe just starting with some phone calls and having some individual conversations and letting them know we're trying to prioritize things here, or we're just going through a process and just kind of start with some more casual conversations and asking people if you have the opportunity, you could, well, I was going to say you could have people come together for a little brainstorming meeting, but I guess we can't do that now. So I would say, probably just start with the kind of those individual approaches. And I think what'll happen is as you start comparing notes from those conversations, you might see some things bubble to the surface then that you can sort of, start building upon.
Thank you. And as far as closing thoughts from our end, anyone viewing this webinar can always reach TVC at info@tvcreates.org and visit our website, which is also www.tvcreates.org. And we really appreciate you, Jeff, for taking the time to talk about planning for budget deficits today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.